All right, hello everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of our crash course on faith. So I don't think part 1 isn't strictly necessary to kind of follow what's going on here, but in part 1 I gave a definition of faith, and so that might be kind of helpful for thinking about some of the things we'll talk about here, but not strictly necessary. So if you want to go back and watch part 1, I'll link that in the description, but if not, we're going to be talking about faith and rationality. So similar to part 1, this is basically going to be covering the second half of this article. So this article was published in the Rowman and Littlefield Handbook for Philosophy of Religion. It was actually published very recently, I think 2021 is the date. So the chapter is called Faith and Reason. So I will also link that in the description if you want a little more detail or you want to read rather than listen or whatever. I definitely recommend, if you enjoy the content of this video, to check that article out. So part 1 focused on descriptive questions, the question of what is faith. Part 2, we're going to focus on normative questions. So the normative question is about rational faith. What is it for faith to be rational? So not just what is faith, but what is rational faith? What makes faith rational? What makes it irrational? So first we'll talk about 3 views about the relationship between faith and rationality, and then I'll tell you which one is the correct one. And then we'll talk about 3 ways that rational faith might go beyond the evidence. So in the previous video, we talked a little bit about the resilience of faith, how faith helps us keep our commitments, even in light of counter-evidence. You could interpret this as a way of faith going beyond the evidence, but then the question is, wouldn't that be irrational? Shouldn't we be very sensitive to evidence if we're rational? So we're going to talk about ways that rational faith might go beyond the evidence in this video. The first is involving faith and testimony. The second is about faith and confidence. And then the third is about faith and permissivism. If you don't know what that is, hold tight, we'll get to it. All right, so first I'm going to start off with sort of 3 views you might take about the relationship between faith and rationality. The first is the view that faith is always rational. So anyone who has faith in anything, and we talked about in the last video, it doesn't just have to be faith in God, but it can be faith in your spouse or faith in the Constitution or faith in recycling. Any of these types of faith are always rational. No, so this is not a good view of faith. Whether faith is rational depends on what you have faith in. So maybe for a lot of people, faith in their spouse is rational. Maybe for a lot of people, faith in God is rational. But faith that your magic 8 ball is perfectly reliable, which for those of you who maybe are too young, it's this black ball that you shake and you ask it a question and it gives you a random answer. Well, yes, no, definitely, whatever. Faith that your magic 8 ball is perfectly reliable, that's not rational, right? Faith that your horoscope is the answer to all your problems, that's not rational. I hate to say it, but faith that a lot of politicians are going to be saving us from all our problems, also probably not rational. So the view that faith is always rational is a bad one. Faith is a complicated thing, a thing that we can have towards lots of different objects, similar to belief. Beliefs can be rational, beliefs can be irrational. Same with faith. Faith can be rational, faith can be irrational. Okay. Well, that brings us to a second view. And I have heard people say this, and that's the view that faith is always irrational. Some people really closely associate faith with religious faith and say it's always irrational. And there's also a view that's slightly different than that view, but it's a view called fideism. Some people think Kierkegaard had a view like this, which says that faith is irrational, but it's actually a good thing. It's a noble feature of faith, that it's irrational and we should pursue to have faith at all costs. It's kind of this highest good we could pursue, even though it's irrational. And then, like I said, some people, like the new atheists, I think have a view like this. They think faith is irrational, so we should just avoid it at all costs. So there's actually really sort of 2 camps under the view that faith is always irrational. But again, I just don't think this is true. I don't think we should say all faith is rational or all faith is irrational. Again, I think of faith like a belief. It can be rational, but it can be irrational. And if you're convinced that faith is always irrational, part of the goal of this video is to use tools from epistemology to try to explain ways that faith could be rational, but in some sense go beyond the evidence. But another way that I can kind of motivate this idea that's not always irrational is that I think faith has an important role to play. In the last video, we talked about commitment. Faith is an important part of keeping our commitments to others, to ourselves, to God. And I think because of that, there's a key role that faith plays for anyone who has commitments. And that doesn't just have to be a religious commitment, it can be a non-religious commitment as well. And so I think just saying that faith is always irrational is sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So we don't like that view, we don't like that view. Well, here's another view. Maybe sometimes faith is rational and sometimes faith is irrational. Woo, this is the view I like. I think this is the correct view. I think it's in a lot of ways an intuitive view, especially if you think of faith. You know, faith is in a lot of ways like a belief. I'm not saying faith is a belief. In the last video, we talked about how faith and belief are different, actually. But faith can be rational and faith can be irrational, right? So I think that's the best view to hold of faith. And I think Christians, atheists alike, should be able to agree that sometimes faith is rational and sometimes it's irrational. And I do wonder if sometimes, especially those who say faith is always irrational, they might just be working with a definition of faith that's really different than the one I'm sort of thinking of. So some people say faith is just believing things without evidence or believing things that you know are false. Maybe that's always irrational, but that's not what I mean by faith. I could use a different word. I could call it trust or something, right? But I think the thing I'm interested in, it's sometimes rational and sometimes irrational. Excuse me. Okay. So that brings us to kind of our main question. We're not saying faith is always rational, but that's sometimes rational. But faith is also resilient, and it's resilient in the face of counter evidence. And so in that sense, it goes beyond the evidence. And so this sort of leads us to this question: how could faith go beyond the evidence and be resilient in light of counter evidence, but at the same time be rational? And I want to talk about 3 ways this can happen. And so one thing that's kind of cool about this picture is you can actually accept some of these ways, but not others. So you might really like the first one, but not like the second 2, or really like the third one and the first one, but not the second one, you know, whatever. I'm going to give 3 kind of independent ways you might think that faith could go beyond the evidence and still be rational. And all of these have some kind of either representation in the literature. For some of them, I'll give specific people that have defended them, or I think they have a good basis in kind of epistemology and some of the recent things that have been happening in the epistemology literature. So we'll get more into that. But here's the 3 views. First has to do with faith and testimony. The second, faith and confidence. And the third, faith and permissivism. Okay, so basically how this is going to go is first I'm going to explain each of the views, and then I'm going to talk about how on that view of faith is rational. And I'm also going to talk about how on that view of faith goes beyond the evidence. So those are sort of giving you the 2 components of each view after kind of explaining what the view is. Okay, so here's the first view of faith. Faith is based on testimony. When we have faith, what we're doing is we're believing someone. We're believing another's testimony. So if you say, I'll pick you up from the airport and I believe you, then I have faith that what you said is true. And I have faith that you're reliable, or even faith in you. And in the same way, if you have faith that God exists or faith in God, you will believe God's testimony. You can kind of give a religious version of this as well. And I do think there's a pretty good historical precedent for this sort of view. Augustine, Locke, and Aquinas all, maybe not defended this exact view, but I think, hinted at versions of this view. I think Aquinas had a couple different distinctions, different kinds of faith, but this is similar to one of the views Aquinas had. So there is a kind of nice historical precedent that connects faith and testimony closely. So Anscombe also, I think, had a view like this, where Anscombe said, faith isn't just believing that P, faith is believing someone that P. So it kind of captures this interpersonal element of faith really well. And also Linda Zagzebski has recently, I think, written some papers that sort of connect faith and testimony closely together. One thing that's nice about this view is that it sort of brings out the connection between faith and trust really well. So a lot of people will define faith as trust, or at least say that faith and trust are very closely connected. I'm sympathetic to that kind of picture. And this can explain why. When we trust someone's testimony, we have faith. So it can kind of explain the connection to faith and trust. It also can capture this idea that faith requires us to rely on other people. When we believe someone else's testimony, that often leads us to rely on them and sort of act on whatever they said. So again, if you pick me up from the airport and I believe you, I'm not going to call a taxi when I land. I'm going to go outside and text you or wait for you, right? That's because I believe your testimony. So I'm demonstrating faith that what you said is true. And that requires me to sort of rely on you to come pick me up from the airport. Okay, so we have this view that faith is based on testimony. The first question is this view of faith rational? Yeah, I think definitely yes. So that's because testimony is a very important source of knowledge. When you think about it, you might say, no, I don't like testimony. I want to verify things with my own two eyes. And some of my students say this when we talked about testimony. But notice that so many pieces of our knowledge we wouldn't have if we didn't rely on testimony. So much of our knowledge comes from testimony, like an incredible amount. And I think when you really start to reflect, you start to see this. So scientific knowledge is one example. In most cases, you haven't actually gone out and done a scientific experiment yourself. Some people do in labs, they'll sort of like do little mini experiments that verify things that scientists have done, but scientists are the ones doing the legit experiments. And for most of our scientific knowledge, we're just trusting the testimony of the scientists. Even if you're going and reading the journal articles or reading a textbook directly, you're still trusting the testimony of the scientist rather than going and verifying some experiment yourself. So most of our scientific knowledge is based on testimony. Most of our geographical knowledge is also based on testimony. I have a map of the world right here, but most of us, I mean, if you're lucky, you've maybe been to like 30 countries or 40. Most of us haven't even been to half of the world's countries, much less verified that like this continent looks like this and this country is east of this country. You know, we really haven't. We're trusting the testimony of the map makers, of the cardiologists to tell us that the world actually is the way that it is. So a lot of our geographical knowledge is based on testimony. And notice too, just all the time, when we're trying to figure out what's true, where to go, asking someone for directions, your mom says she's, you know, at the park right now, we just believe people, right? Of course, if we have good reason to think someone's lying or they're confused or they're biased, but maybe we don't always believe them. But in most cases, people seem reasonable, people seem like to know, like they know what they're talking about. We trust people. So we would lose a lot of our everyday knowledge if we stopped relying on testimony. Of course, this doesn't mean we should always trust testimony. Again, we know that people lie. Sometimes we have good indicators that people are lying or confused. And if you just believe testimony too easily, some people say that's called gullibility, that may not be rational, right? So we shouldn't always trust testimony. Nonetheless, testimony is sort of this ubiquitous source of knowledge. Without it, we would really be not necessarily radical skeptics, but much more skeptical than we currently are. And it would be really hard to get by if you never trusted testimony. So it's rational to base our attitudes, whether that's faith or belief, on testimony. Okay, second question, does this view of faith go beyond the evidence? I think this is a good question, and this is a little bit of a trickier one. Because it's like, look, you're just basing your faith on testimony, so you have the evidence, that's the testimony, and then that sort of rationalizes your faith. But I think if we think about this a little harder, we can see that there's at least a sense in which this goes beyond the evidence. So sometimes we will have only testimony to go on, and we have to take a risk, and we have to choose to trust someone. So we got our guy here waiting for his friend at the airport. Maybe a taxi is extremely expensive, and so he needs to kind of sit there and wait for his friend to pick him up. And he's taking a little bit of risk. Maybe he'll be late to an appointment if his friend doesn't show, right? And all he has right now is testimony to go on. Maybe he doesn't have outside evidence that his friend is on his way, except for his friend's testimony. And so the thought is here that even though faith is based on the testimony, which is evidence, faith does go beyond certain sources of evidence in the sense that you're not requiring independent verification to believe someone. So you're not going to say, I only believe you if, I can get your location on my phone and then verify from that you're actually driving towards me, right? And so faith goes beyond certain sources of evidence, even if it's still based on testimony and thus rational. Okay. So that's view one. That's why faith being based on testimony is rational. but it also goes beyond at least certain sources of evidence. All right, here's view 2. View 2 says that faith remains consistent even as evidence slightly changes our confidence levels. So sometimes evidence changes our confidence levels, but doesn't always change our beliefs. If you check the forecast and there's a 95% chance of rain tomorrow, you'll believe and you'll be about 0.95 confident that it will rain tomorrow. Let's say then you check it again a few hours later. Now there's only an 85% chance of rain tomorrow. Still a pretty high chance. So you'll still believe it'll rain tomorrow. Your confidence will move down a little bit. Then you could imagine a similar situation where the opposite happened and then your confidence moved up. So sometimes, again, evidence will change how confident we are. It doesn't always change our beliefs. If the chance of rain goes from 95 to 10%, then it might change your belief. It probably should change your belief, right? But in every case, it's not just because our confidence changes doesn't mean our beliefs change. And the idea is that maybe faith is kind of similar to belief, and that it's kind of steadfast, even in light of at least small changes in our confidence. And then maybe when there's big changes in our confidence, where we get lots of counter evidence, then that's when we should give up our faith. And I actually have an entire video about this. I will link it in the description, but go check this video out if you want to kind of learn more about that. And there I sort of spend a little bit more time introducing belief and confidence, talking a little more about them. I don't have as much time to go into as much detail here. But the first question is, does this go beyond the evidence? Does it go beyond the evidence if faith remains consistent, even though as evidence changes our confidence levels? Yes, it does go beyond the evidence. So the faith, you can also see it as a belief, but the faith is remaining steadfast, even as our evidence is going up and down, right? So it's going beyond the evidence in the sense that it's not sensitive to every little tiny change in evidence. I'll give 2 examples of this to make this a little more concrete. The first is the case where your brother is accused of murder. And maybe at first you think it's just totally whack, like there's no way he did it. There's just someone that hates him for whatever reason, and that's trying to frame him, let's say. But then you start to say, oh, he did find his fingerprints at the site, but there is maybe another reason they would have found those. And we start to get these little pieces of evidence against him. So at first, you have faith that your brother's innocent, and you're very highly confident that he's innocent. And then as you get these little pieces of evidence, your confidence might change. Your confidence might go down a little bit that he's innocent. But unless there's like some pretty decisive evidence that your brother did it, if it's just these little pieces of evidence and there is this kind of alternative explanation, then you can be rational and continue to have faith in your brother's innocence. You might think this is similar about religious faith. So I think there are cases where, especially when someone starts off with a good basis for faith that there's an all-good, all-powerful God, and then they say, wow, there is a lot of evil in this world, and that's really tough. I think in certain evidential situations, what that should do is lower their confidence that there's an all-good, all-powerful God. But I don't think that automatically means that they have to just give up the belief right then and there. I think it'll just depend on the weight of the evidence for and against, but I think this can be a case where your confidence changes, but your faith that God exists does not change. Okay, sorry. Okay, so question number 2, is this rational? Is it rational to maintain your faith in light of these bits of evidence you get that change your confidence? And I think the answer is pretty clearly yes. Think back to our weather example. Our weather example showed that belief is consistent with a number of different confidence levels. Belief might not be, believing that it's going to rain tomorrow may not be consistent with, a 0.01 confidence level, right? So if you're believing it's going to rain, but your confidence is down here, yeah, that might not be rational, right? But look, we're more confident in some things we believe than in others, right? My confidence in 1 + 1 = 2 is like pretty close to 1. But my confidence that my car is parked outside, I saw it a couple hours ago, but my husband could have moved it, whatever, it might have been stolen. It's definitely less than 1, right? And then my confidence that it will rain tomorrow is like 0.75. It rains almost every day in Florida, but not every single day, like probably, yeah, about 3 out of 4 days, right? So I believe all those things, but my confidence levels are different. I'm more confident in some things I believe than others. That's perfectly rational. And again, this doesn't mean that having faith that something's true or believing that something's true is consistent with any confidence level, or that I should never give up my faith or my belief. It's just that sometimes our confidence can move around, maybe in this range above 0.5, let's say. Where we draw the line is an interesting question that I won't take a stand on here, although I've thought about that some. But our confidence can move around, and we don't necessarily have to just give up our belief as soon as our confidence changes the tiniest amount. Yeah, so like I said, maybe we draw the line around 0.5. It does seem weird to believe something, but think that it's more likely false than true. So there's interesting questions around this, but the point is just that faith can go beyond the evidence in the sense that it moves our confidence levels, but doesn't change the fact that we have faith. And this can be rational. It's already kind of uncontroversial among the large majority of epistemologists that this can happen with belief. So why not faith too? Okay, here's the third view. The third view is that we can take the faithful attitude that's permitted but not required by our evidence. Let me say a little bit more about this. This was the faith and permissivism thing. Okay, so we'll start with this observation that sometimes our evidence is really complicated and difficult to evaluate. Cases where it's not complicated would be like 1 + 1 = 2. Or, it's cloudy today, right? I can just look outside and see that's cloudy. Not a very complicated belief to form on the basis of evidence. 1 + 1 = 2, that just is very obviously true. My evidence clearly supports that. But there are other cases where you're like, oh, this could really go either way. Like, I don't know if you watch like Making of a Murderer. I was like, he did it, he didn't do it. I was like back and forth the entire time. A lot of like sort of interesting court cases can be like this. A lot of controversial issues like, abortion, a lot of these kind of hot topics. The evidence can be complicated and difficult to evaluate. And even if you have a strong opinion on one side or the other, I think it's worth saying there's good arguments on both sides for a lot of these controversial topics, like, gun control is another example. And this leads us to what's called permissivism. So permissivism is the view that sometimes, given some evidence, there's multiple different but equally rational responses to that evidence. So you and I might have looked at all the same arguments for and against abortion, but have come to different conclusions. One of us is pro-life, one of us is pro-choice. Permissivism would say one of you isn't automatically irrational. You might have just sort of taken different perspectives on the evidence or interpreted the evidence differently. Again, this juror example, when we have a complicated court case where there's multiple suspects that seem like there's a pretty good story or explanation of how they did it, how person A did it versus how person B did it. Two jurors might say, person A did it, the other one might say person B did it. And so the jurors disagree, but neither of them is irrational. It's just that the evidence is complicated and there's more than one good explanation of the evidence. Okay. So how does this relate to faith? Well, the idea is that sometimes we're in a situation where it's not necessarily like, it could be a controversial issue, but we might just be faced with evidence that's inconclusive in the way we've been talking about. But one of the attitudes that's rational for us is more faithful than another. And so what we can do is say, well, look, both believing this thing and withholding, they're rationally consistent with my evidence. Really, either one would be rational for me to take. So I'm going to believe because that's the more faithful attitude. Okay. Question, does this go beyond the evidence? Yes, because in these permissive cases, our evidence doesn't point us in a particular direction. It doesn't force us to believe on pains of irrationality. It doesn't force us to disbelieve on pains of irrationality. It kind of leaves things open. And so we can say, look, this attitude is more faithful, so I'm going to pick that one. Not because my evidence forces it on me, but for other reasons. So we have multiple attitudes that are both equally rational given our evidence, and we step beyond the evidence. Sorry, to take the faithful attitude. So one example that William James, who I'm a huge fan of, some of you might know, gives is of a hiker who has been hiking for a long time and gets lost. I'm sure some of you have heard me give this case already, and finally finds a path back home. But to get across that path, let's imagine it's not quite this good. There's a pretty steep crevice and the hiker's like, oh, I can, I don't know if I can make it. It's like about a 50-50 chance. So maybe the hiker, let's say the evidence suggests that there's a chance they could make it. So it could be rational to believe they could make it, but also it's uncertain enough that it could be rational for the hiker to withhold belief and say, I don't really know if I can make it. I'm going to be kind of uncommittal about that. The hiker knows if I believe I'm going to make this jump, that's going to give me a lot more sort of confidence and energy and motivation to try. Whereas if I'm withholding belief, I'm going to be a lot more timid and uncertain, and it's actually going to make it less likely to make the jump. And in that case, the hiker can take the faithful attitude and say, look, the attitude like that demonstrates faith in myself and my jumping abilities and my ability to get back home is belief. That's rational given my evidence. So I'm going to go ahead and take that attitude. And then that also will give them that extra motivation to sort of make that jump. I think similarly, people can be in this sort of situation with respect to belief in God. So this is going to be controversial, but I think when it comes to belief in God, especially for certain people in their evidence, the evidence can be very complicated. There's arguments for God's existence that are interesting and compelling, but the problem of evil is hard. The problem of divine hiddenness is hard, right? And these people might be kind of, well, look, I've had these religious experiences, but I can also give this naturalistic explanation for them. And the evidence is just complicated. And they might say, I think given my evidence and given these arguments for God that I know of, and given these religious experiences, it might be rational for me to believe in God. On the other hand, I have these alternative explanations for some of these facts, and I don't really know what to say about the problem of evil. It may be rational for me to not believe in God, to be agnostic or even an atheist. And that person can say, look, my evidence isn't forcing one of these perspectives on me, but believing in God is the faithful attitude. And so I'm going to take that attitude. So again, they're stepping beyond the evidence. They're saying, my evidence isn't settling this question for me, so I'm just going to choose to take the faithful attitude. And that one's rational given my evidence, but my evidence doesn't require that I take that attitude. Okay, question number 2, is it rational to do this? Is it rational to take the attitude that's permitted but not required by your evidence? It's actually rational by definition. So by stipulation, in the cases we're talking about, the attitude you're taking is rationally permitted. So it's rational given your evidence. So it's a rational response to your evidence. And so, it's pretty uncontroversial that doing this is going to be rational. So this isn't saying that all cases are permissive cases, or you can just take any attitude in any circumstance. I'm just going to believe 1 + 1 = 3 because, I want to or whatever. No, of course not. They have to actually be cases where your evidence permits more than one rational response. But in those kinds of cases, you can choose to take the faithful attitude rather than the less faithful attitude. And I think it's good that this doesn't let you just take any attitude towards anything in any circumstance, because faith's going beyond the evidence should have limits. It shouldn't be able to just ignore evidence. And in this view, faith is constrained by evidence. It's not determined by evidence. So faith tells you, the evidence tells you what attitudes are sort of open for you. And then you can kind of use faith to distinguish between attitudes when you're in a permissive case. Okay, so let's just review very quickly. Way 1 was faith and testimony. Way 2 was faith and confidence. Way 3, faith and permissivism. So here's what's cool. I said you can mix and match these, so you can accept some and reject others, but I also think you can combine them all together. So here's an example that actually includes all 3 ways that faith might be rational but go beyond the evidence. Let's say you're engaged and you're going to be married soon. And your faith that you are marrying the right person and that you and your fiance will make it and have a successful long marriage is based on your fiance's testimony that they want to be with you, that they'll be faithful to you, etc. And you can remain steadfast in this faith, even in light of counter evidence that lowers your confidence. So maybe I'll learn that 50% of marriages end in divorce. And that might lower my confidence a little bit that my spouse and I will remain faithful to each other, but I might also still have some evidence that maybe will be an exception to that statistic. I still think you shouldn't totally ignore the base rate in that case, but maybe you kind of balance your previous high confidence against that base rate, and it lowers your confidence some, right? You might also be in a permissive case. So it might be rational for you to believe that your marriage will be successful and you'll stay married. It might also be rational for you to withhold belief. And so if I have faith that my marriage will be successful, it can actually go beyond the evidence in all three of the ways discussed above. So I think that's kind of cool. You can reject some and accept others, but you can also sort of put them all together into one case. All right, so now let's just review sort of what we've covered. We've talked about 3 views of faith and rationality. And we concluded that sometimes faith is rational and sometimes faith is irrational. So we shouldn't sort of have a blanket view of faith and rationality. Depends on the case. Then we talked about 3 ways that faith might be rational but go beyond the evidence: faith and testimony, faith and confidence, and then faith and permissivism. So I am going on a long trip this summer. I will actually be traveling a lot of different places. So I will be kind of in and out, maybe without internet, for most of July. But I hope to come back and make some more videos in August. So if you have a specific topic you want me to cover, or some kind of philosophical view you're interested, you want to hear from me on, or just a video you'd like me to make, let me know in the comments. I'm looking for ideas of videos to make. Most of my stuff is kind of philosophy related, and specifically epistemology, philosophy of religion, but there's so many topics within that. So I'd love to hear some feedback from you on some videos that you want to see from me, and hopefully I will see a lot of you back here in August.